Hello people, today we are going to talk about one of the most protected tank of its time. No tank gun could penetrate its thick armor, and for a short period of time this tank seemed to be almost invulnerable. Meet Matilda, or Infantry Tank Mark II, one of the most successful projects of British engineers and the queen of the battlefield. Unfortunately, her reign was short-lived. Matilda is the most famous British tank of the World War II, and such fame is well deserved. At the time of its appearance, this slow-moving but very well protected combat vehicle turned out to be the best that the British tank industry could give its armed forces. However, the Matilda's service in the British Army was short-lived. By mid-1942, these vehicles began to disappear from the scene, giving way to American-made tanks. Now let us dive really deep into the history of this legendary tank, which left a deep mark on the world tank building. In 1934, the British armored forces began to slowly emerge from the lethargic sleep in which they had remained for almost 5 years. This was largely possible thanks to Sir Percy Hobart, who in 1934 became Inspector of the Royal Armoured Corps. At the same time, Sir Hugh Ellis took over the post of Head of Armament for the English Army. The 30s were generally a time of experimentation, and this fully applied to the British armored forces. The new leadership brought ideas that, after a short time, greatly changed the appearance of British tanks. The general system of building British tank units in the mid-30s generally followed global trends. The backbone consisted of medium tanks, the development of which, however, was greatly stalled. A worthy replacement for the outdated medium tank Mark I and Mark II was never found, and only 3 medium tanks Mark III were produced. The British gradually abandoned tankettes in favor of more efficient light tanks. It was these vehicles that became the most popular pre-war British tanks. While developing light tanks with bulletproof armor, the British military closely monitored what was happening in other countries. First of all, this concerned France, which at that time had the largest fleet of armored vehicles. The French also had a lot of problems with the development of tanks, but they took a different path. Instead of maneuverability, they relied on armor, drawing on the experience of the First World War. In 1934, Vickers, Armstrong and Cardinal Lloyd were tasked to develop a tank which was supposed to have 25mm thick armor, a speed of about 16 km per hour, and a machine gun as an armament. Further development of this concept led to the creation of the first infantry tank, the A-11, designated Infantry Tank Mark I. At the same time, technical specifications for a larger tank were developed. The thickness of its armor and maximum speed remained the same, but the weapons had to be more powerful. As such, it was planned to use a 2-pounder gun, which at that time was jointly developed by Vickers Armstrong and the Royal Arsenal Woolwich. Unlike the light infantry tank Mark I, Vickers Armstrong did not get the development of a medium infantry tank. The design center for this tank was Royal Arsenal Woolwich. The first sketches of the A-12 infantry tank appeared in September 1936, at a time when the A-11 prototype had already entered testing. Over the time since the launch of the infantry tank development program, the requirements for protection changed. For the A-11, the armor thickness increased to 60 mm, as for the project designated A-12 to 75 mm. A significant difference between the A-12 and previous Royal Arsenal Woolwich design was that this time the Arsenal was only the developer of the tank. The contractor was the locomotive building company, the Vulcan Foundry Limited from Newton Le Wilson in Lancashire. In 1937, contract was concluded for the production of 2 prototypes with a total cost of £30,000. The first prototype, designated infantry tank A-12 E1, was sent to the Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment training ground at Farnborough on April 11, 1938. The tank turned out to be built at a completely different quality level than the A-11, which by that time had been put into production as the infantry tank Mark I. The 26-ton combat vehicle turned out to be slow, but still 24 km per hour on the highway and 15 km per hour off-road. This is not at all the 12 km per hour that the infantry tank Mark I developed on the highway. Much more important is that it was a full-fledged combat vehicle, which combined powerful armor and weapons that were quite adequate for that period. However, high explosive fragmentation shells were not included in the ammunition load of the 2-pounder gun. According to the British military, a machine gun was enough for a tank to fight infantry, and it only needed cannon to fight tanks. The first contract for the production of 140 medium tanks Mark II was awarded to Vulcan in June 1938. In August 1938, another contract was signed with the engineering company Ruston and Hornsby Limited for the production of 40 infantry tank Mark II. Almost at the same time, one more contract was signed with the engineering company John Fowler and Company. The order volume was the same, 40 tanks. Next was the carriage building company London, Midland and Scottish Railway. These contracts supposed the production of 120 tanks. Another locomotive company, the North British Locomotive Company of Glasgow, was awarded a contract to produce 50 tanks. And the latest to join the list of manufacturers was the shipyard Harland and Wolff Limited from Belfast. It was awarded contract for the production of 130 infantry tank Mark II. Such a large list of enterprises clearly demonstrates how the British War Office treated the new tank. The launch of mass production of the infantry tank Mark II coincided with the beginning of the World War II. The first tanks left the factories in September 1939. The combat debut of the infantry tank Mark II took place on the same day as its older brother, the infantry tank Mark I. On the 21st of May 1940, tanks from the 7th and 4th Royal Tank Regiments counter-attacked units of the German 7th Panzer Division and the SS Totenkopf Division. Machine gun and cannon infantry tanks operated together. For the infantry tank Mark I, the battles in France turned out to be a death sentence. As for the infantry tank Mark II, the situation was completely different. Despite the contradictory results of combat use, it must be admitted that this vehicle was the best that the British tank industry produced at that time. Unlike the cruiser tank Mark IV, the reliability of the infantry tank was clearly better. After the critical phase of the Battle of Britain had passed, and it became clear that the Germans would no longer land on the Isles, the British were able to transfer reinforcement to North Africa. Among them were the infantry tanks Mark II of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment. At 5 a.m. on December 9, 1940, Operation Compass began, which turned into a formal devastation of the Italian troops. The Italians simply had nothing to hit the thick-skinned British tanks. Compared to what the 7th Tank Regiment was doing at that time, even the exploits of the Tigers looked modest. At that time, the infantry tank received the nickname Queen of the Battlefield. The dominance of these machines was absolute. However, the luck of the British tank crews ran out towards the middle of 1941. On February 14, the first German units arrived in Tripoli. They were headed by General Erwin Rommel, who already had experience fighting infantry tanks. The next meeting with them took place in June 1941. The Germans used 88mm anti-aircraft artillery as anti-tank guns. The large open spaces of the deserts of North Africa made the work of anti-aircraft gunners even easier than in France. The slow British infantry tanks turned out to be convenient targets. Their results were extremely sad. The British lost 64 tanks out of 100. In the third quarter of 1941, the British industry was able to produce only 316 Matildas. However, the British military already at that moment began to seriously think about the prospects of this tank on the battlefield. The result of Operation Crader, which took place from November 18 to December 13, 1941, added doubts. During its course, Matilda tanks were used most extensively and again suffered heavy losses. It turned out that thick armor in North Africa conditions didn't solve much. North Africa became the last theater of operations in which the British used Matilda tanks for their intended purpose. However, a number of British tanks didn't pass through this sieve. Only Churchill was able to defend the honor of the British tank industry. During the battles for Tunisia, this tank came in very handy. Matilda was later used as a training machine, never leaving the mother country, but these tanks fought in the armies of other countries for much longer.